Hello, it's Bradley J. and the Bradley J. Show. I'm with Rich Rubino, and right off the bat, I want to tell you that the phrase rhino,
Yes.
which is used as an insult to Republicans that aren't deemed to be conservative enough, is not a proper thing to say. And we'll explain that in a moment. It turns out that Republicans are not historically super conservative. Rich Rubino is going to tell us about it. He's a political historian. Rich, why
Yes.
don't you launch into your thing?
Yes, absolutely. Well, so the Republican Party was really formed in 1854, and the major issue at the time was slavery. The Republican Party generally had two wings on slavery. There were those who wanted to abolish it where it currently existed, and there were those like Abraham Lincoln who wanted to keep it where it existed, but not allow it in the new territories. But on other issues, they were very much a counterweight to the conservative Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was the conservative party of the time. Martin Van Buren was a very conservative president and a Democrat who literally sold the White House tools so they could not be used for economic stimulation during the Panic of 1837. The Republican Party wanted more funding for education. They wanted a larger role for the federal government, for example. So they really became kind of the counterweight to the conservative Democratic Party. John C. Fremont was the first Republican nominee in 1856. He lost. He was very much an abolitionist, by the way. In 1860, the party nominated Lincoln, who was more of a moderate in terms of slavery.
So the Republican Party started in the 1850s?
Yes, it was a lot newer than the Democratic Party.
What were the parties before that?
You had the original parties were the Democratic. Okay, so if you go back to the Washington administration, George Washington warned of the baleful existence of political parties in his farewell address in 1796, which was published all over the country. In his administration, he was not a member of a political party, although he leaned toward the Federalists. The Federalist Party wanted a more expansive federal government, and he leaned that way. John Adams, the vice president under his administration, was one of the founders of the Federalist Party during the Washington administration. Thomas Jefferson, also Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams were Federalists and began the Federalist Party. Now, contrary-wise, Thomas Jefferson began what's called the Democratic Republican Party. And the Democratic Republican Party wanted a more truncated view of government. They wanted a small government, and they supported an agrarian republic, meaning they're very much for the farmers. They tended to favor farmers versus big cities.
They feared that the United States, the new United States, would end up having a king again, and they wanted to stay away from that. And Adams and
yeah,
and Hamilton they were Federalists, right? And Adams kind of leaned toward a more English style of kingly government, right?
Yeah, he actually wanted George Washington to be called His Excellency. But it's fascinating you brought that up, because here's another thing that a lot of people don't realize today. If you go back to the original argument, the original document we had prior to the United States Constitution was called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, and it really limited the size and scope of the government. So in 1787, in Philadelphia, the purpose, those 56 individuals who met in Philadelphia, was to amend the articles, not to create a completely different document. So they went in there that hot summer in 1787, and they created a new document, and that document, the United States Constitution, increase the size of government. It's kind of interesting today, because today we look at libertarians or conservatives as those who support the Constitution, and more liberals as people who have a more, shall we say, expansive view of the Constitution. But if you go back to the 1780s, the conservatives were the ones who opposed the Constitution. They were called the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were the ones who supported the Constitution and tried to get it ratified. And part of how they got it ratified was they included the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, into the document in order to get the support of some of those anti-federalists. But those who supported the articles included Patrick Henry, for example, who warned, you're talking about the possibility of a monarchy, he warned that the new document, the Constitution, has an awful squinting. It squints toward monarchy.
Mm-hmm.
That was the fear of the Constitution, that it would give too much power to the federal government. And that was the continued fear Thomas Jefferson had, whereas folks like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton tended to be more, shall we say, monarchical friendly.
And so the original Constitution, pre amendments leaned federalist. It leaned monarchical, and it only got ratified because they added those other things on there, the amendments, to satisfy the Democratic Republicans like Jefferson.
Yeah, not so much the Democratic Republicans. This was 1787, so the political parties hadn't been formed yet. It was what's called the Anti-Federalists.
Okay, the Anti-Federalists.
And the Anti-Federalists are those who favored the original Articles of Confederation or Perpetual Union and thought the Constitution was too monarchical and that it would create too big of a government. And there were still some, John Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts, for example, who still voted against the Constitution because he believed that even with the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, oftentimes, by the way, when people, especially when people point to the Constitution, they oftentimes, people who have a more conservative view today, will often point more to the Bill of Rights than the actual body or the text of the Constitution, or say, well, we have the First Amendment right, we have the Fourth Amendment right, we have the Ninth Amendment right. And that really did try to limit the size of government. So that was kind of the compromise that got the Constitution to be ratified. You actually had the Federalist Papers, which were written by Alexander Hamilton. For example, John Jay was another one of the authors, and they really tried to make the case for the new Constitution. But once the Constitution was ratified, then they had the first presidential election. You had George Washington serving 2 terms, and then the first real presidential election that was contested was 1796 between John Adams, who was the Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, who was a Democratic Republican. And ever since then, America, despite George Washington's admonition, have had political parties.
So, did John Adams feel that the common people were really unable to govern themselves?
I think that most of the people in that period of time basically did believe that. Most of them were essentially were very much landowners. Most of the founders were very wealthy. I think that it was really up until Andrew Jackson came in and he was elected in 1828, served in 1829. They actually had somebody who wasn't part of that gentry class. He was the first American who came from really a hard scrabble background. You had the kind of Virginia dynasty of Jefferson and Madison, Monroe, and then you had the Massachusetts dynasty of John Adams and John Quincy Adams. Andrew Jackson he was the first person who tried to really become the people's president. He called himself the Tribune of the People, or the People's Tribune. Mm-hmm. And when he got elected, his inauguration, people from all over the country thought this guy is actually one of us. So accordingly, they actually came to his inauguration, to the point that there were so many people at what was called the Executive Mansion. Today it's called the White House's lawn, that they had to sneak Andrew Jackson in through the back after having him stay in the hotel the night before, so they could get in there, because they were afraid that he was going to be rampaged by all these supporters who had come. But I think most presidents prior to Andrew Jackson basically did essentially believe they certainly were not representatives of the common man.
So we think of Greece as the birthplace of the idea of democracy, but Plato did not believe the common people were able to govern themselves. They thought it would be a mess. And sometimes I wonder. But he envisioned a group of philosopher kings where a certain level of patrician would go to school and have this rigorous training in philosophy and everything needed to benevolently govern, and these philosopher kings would be chosen somehow from that class, which is a third option. We've had, you go to communism that way, and you go to an extreme democracy, and both of them have issues. It is a dirty business. I wonder how the philosopher king thing would have turned out. I do wish that the people that we got to choose from were of a higher class in some, especially these days. That's what I wish. It'd be good if the people still got to choose, but chose from a group of people who knew what the heck they were doing. Like there should be some training for being a world leader, because people get the gig and they have no clue. And every 4 years or 8 years, they have to relearn it. It must take them a year to get up to speed. Even if they're good at it, and a lot of people, well, not a lot necessarily, but some really commit malpractice in the office.
It's fascinating that you brought up Plato with the philosopher kings, because Aristotle had a different theory. He wanted a polity. He essentially, if you read when he talks about on Aristotle's The Politics, he criticizes totalitarian regimes, certainly, but he also criticizes democracies. He criticized kind of the plebeian view of a democracy, and his view of democracy was kind of that Athenian view, where it's basically the last ravages of it are New England town meetings, where people literally go there and they literally vote themselves on measures, as opposed to voting for other people and having those people vote for people. But and rather than having those people then vote on measures. But his basic view is that there needs to be kind of an amalgamation. He called it a polity, not necessarily something where it's a dictatorship on the one hand, and not something that is where the people, almost you could call it, I guess, the tyranny of the majority on the other side. So, I mean, they both had, Plato and Aristotle certainly had their own views, if you will, on the role of government. But Socrates was interesting, because I think Socrates viewed himself as more of one of the people in many respects, because if you look at why did they give him hemlock at the end of his life? Because the fear was, they thought that he was essentially trying to corrupt the youth by telling them to pray to different gods, for example. He would be, if he was contemporaneous, and by the way, I'm talking not so much about Plato, I'm talking about Socrates, and Plato obviously wrote about Socrates, and he was really one of the only people who wrote about him, so I'm assuming that came from Plato. But Socrates would go around and bother people and ask them questions everywhere. He'd say, what do you think of this, of the role of government? And people get annoyed by him. So I think if he were a contemporaneous individual, I think Socrates would essentially be an internet troll.
Socrates,
yeah, who Plato wrote about. He would.
So you think? Well,
yeah.
I mean, he was kind of a troll. He'd sit in the square there, just asking these people questions, just to using the Socratic method. So, if this were the case, what would you say? Oh, okay, well, so that he was kind of a troll sitting there in
He'd be on
dirty gown.
He'd be on Facebook all
dirty
day long.
Robes.
He'd be on Facebook. He'd be on Facebook annoying people, and he'd be getting 1 month bans and being in Facebook jail all the time.
Okay, now, and there may be something. Those guys did spend all their time thinking, and there might have been something to what they say. Maybe the great unwashed back in the day, in classical Greece, maybe the common people there were dumber than now, but maybe not, because spectacularly dumb people around these days too, and they're allowed to vote. They even vote against their own interest. That's the thing. You think, well, everyone should be allowed to vote because they should be able to protect their own interests, but they're fooled and they vote against their own interests sometimes. Whatever. It's better than it's worked out pretty well economically. We're kicking ass in that department, so whatever.
Although the alternative would be to have a direct democracy, an Athenian democracy, where everybody literally goes where everyone literally meets someplace at a town meeting. Today, Ross Perot talked about this in '92, maybe having electronically, and every measure comes up. The average person sitting there on their computer is voting yes or no on the agriculture appropriations reauthorization or something.
So you see, you wouldn't want that, because they really have no clue about that. And so maybe you can extrapolate that further to say that there's so much stuff that people have no clue about, that maybe there should be some bar that you have to surmount to be able to vote. And then, of course, you run into problems for literacy, language, etc. I get that. So maybe what we have here is the best situation, best system, all boiled down, warts and all. So back to Republicans weren't always conservative. Now there's super duper. Would you say it's super duper conservative or super duper self-serving under the guise of conservatism? What's going on now? Has it ever been as radical now? Has that party ever been as radically conservative as it is now?
Well, I don't think it's conservative as much as it's populist, because on some issues like trade and foreign intervention, the party is taking positions that were essentially the Democrats' views during the George W. Bush administration. On foreign policy, they're less interventionist. Most of them are opposed to the idea of the Iraq War. They talk about the neoconservative influence in the Republican Party. Neoconservatives were hegemonic over the party during the Iraq and Afghanistan war. On trade, The Republican Party essentially helped Bill Clinton bring NAFTA and GATT through the United States Congress, helped bring China into the World Trade Organization. They helped bringing CAFTA through under George W. Bush. Now, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they were working with Barack Obama to get that through Congress in 2016. They could not do it, in part because of opposition from Bernie Sanders and the Democrats. But it's interesting about the Republican Party. I was talking about it was originally formed as kind of the liberal party, but throughout its history, it's always had two bloodlines, a liberal wing and a conservative wing. And being a liberal Republican, this is why this term rhino implies that to be a Republican, you have to be a conservative.
Right.
Out American history, if you go back, first of all, if you go back to the beginning of the party, then you go back, for example, Benjamin Harrison, who was president from 1889 to 1893. When he ran for election in 1888, he wanted a protective tariff. He wanted more government spending. Basically what his platform would essentially be what the Democrats' platform has been throughout much of the 19th century, or the 20th century rather. Grover Cleveland, on the other hand, was a Democratic president, and like Martin Van Buren, he wanted less government, and like Martin Van Buren, he had a Great Depression, 19% unemployment, the Panic of 1893. He said he was a guardian president, like basically a constitutional president. He did virtually nothing about the Great Depression, and he was a Democrat, and that is why in 1896, the party completely transmogrified and nominated William Jennings Bryan, who was very much a liberal who wanted more munificent government services. On the Republican side, you had certainly Theodore Roosevelt, who supported trust busting, who wanted a more larger, expansive federal government. You had William Howard Taft, who succeeded him, who actually did support trusts, but Roosevelt thought he did not do enough. So in 1912, he ran against him for the Republican nomination and won most primaries, lost at the convention, then said, I'm stripped to the buff and I'm throwing my hat in the ring. And Roosevelt runs for himself in 1912 as a member of the Progressive Party. He later comes back to become a Republican and was the early front runner for the Republican presidential nomination in 1920, but he died at 60 years old in 1919 before that could happen. Interestingly, I think the time that's the closest to where we are now in the Republican Party was actually the 1920s. Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge, just like Donald Trump, favored a tax cut. They favored restrictions on both legal and illegal immigration. Calvin Coolidge signed a measure to restrict legal immigration in 1924, which was essentially overturned by one signed by LBJ in 1965. And the Republican Party at that time supported less intervention in foreign policy. But, and here's what happened. In the Republican Party, there was still a very liberal wing of the party. And the Democrats that year, after 103 ballots, nominated former U.S. Solicitor General and Ambassador to the United Kingdom, John W. Davis, as their nominee. He was very conservative. Calvin Coolidge, even though he'd been somewhat of a liberal governor of Massachusetts, as president, he was conservative. He was a conservative. He thought the federal government should do very little. This was the high tide, if you will, of conservatism. So what happens? There's a reaction. There's a vacuum on the left, and Robert LaFollette Sr., who had been the governor, senator of Wisconsin, runs as the Progressive Party nominee of the party of Theodore Roosevelt. He runs essentially a liberal Republican, or like someone to the left of both the Republican and the Democratic parties, and consequently, 12 members of the Republican Party that are in the House of Representatives support LaFollette over their own party's nominee, Calvin Coolidge, because the party had this liberal and conservative bloodline. You were not considered a rhino if you were a liberal Republican. And by the way, when they came back to Congress in 1925, they were actually expelled, believe it or not, expelled from the caucus, from the Republican caucus. Imagine this happening today. Imagine if Kevin McCarthy expelled 12 members of the Republican Party from the caucus. He would not be in power. He can't even get rid of George Santos. But this is what happened because the party had such a huge majority at the time. And also, this is very similar to what happened in 2023 with Kevin McCarthy. Kevin McCarthy had to make deals with the conservative wing in order to get their votes, the Freedom Caucus, in order to get their votes to become Speaker of the House. Well, Frederick Gillette, who was somewhat moderate to conservative, kind of a weak speaker, actually from Massachusetts, he had to make deals with the liberal wing of the Republican Party in 1923 in order to maintain his speakership. And that was the last time before 2023 that you actually had a contested speakership in the Republican Party. So at the time, you really had a conservative and a liberal wing of the party. The party, by the way, in the 1930s nominated Republicans who were very liberal. Alf Landon, for example, the Republican nominee in 1936, he took credit for balancing the budget as governor of Kansas. But part of that was he did it with New Deal funds. He was somewhat favorable of the New Deal. In 1940, the party nominated Wendell Willkie, who was a Democrat just a couple of terms. Just in 1932, he was an Al Smith supporter. Rather, in 1928, he supported Al Smith, and he was a delegate for him at the Democratic National Convention. And he was somebody who just converted to become a member of the Republican Party, to which James Watson, who was a senator from Indiana and had been a former Senate Majority Leader, said, I don't mind the church welcoming converts, but I don't want to have them leading the choir on the first day. 1944, Thomas E. Dewey, very much they used to call him a, quote, Me Too Republican, meaning that they supported everything the Democrats favored. He was nominated in 1944, 1948. Then there was a chasm in 1952. Robert Taft, who was called Mr. Republican from Ohio, who was very conservative or libertarian, was an early presidential candidate. Dwight Eisenhower, who did not have any political affiliation, former NATO commander, former president of Columbia University, did not originally want to run for president. He wasn't even a Republican. But when he saw that Taft was going to get the nomination, Taft had been critical of NATO, critical of the United Nations, very much a non-interventionist on foreign policy. Eisenhower reluctantly accepted a draft movement to run for the Republican presidential nomination and eked out a victory over Taft. But he was somebody who was also very much, he was someone that Barry Goldwater, who was the party's 1964 candidate, said he supports a dime store New Deal, meaning essentially he supports everything Roosevelt supported. He just wants to rein it in a little bit. 1960, after Eisenhower two terms, Richard Nixon was the Republican Party nominee. He made a deal. He went to what's called the Pact of Fifth Avenue. He met with Nelson Rockefeller. You hear the term Rockefeller Republican? Rockefeller Republican essentially means liberal Republican. And Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York, was known as a liberal Republican. Nixon made a deal in order for Rockefeller not to run against him for the nomination. Nixon accepted 5 of the planks of his platform and put it into his own platform. He ran for the presidential nomination. Some believe he actually won that year, but of course Kennedy eked out a victory, which is still disputed by some in terms of what happened in Illinois. Some people think that Mayor Daley called in the graveyard vote, for example, and there were some questions about Texas. But Nixon did serve that one term. I mean, Kennedy served until 1963. He died. Johnson succeeds him. And here's where it comes to a head, just like it did in 1924. But this is within the Republican Party. So Barry Goldwater is known as Mr. Conservative. He used to make fun. He used to make jokes and jocularly talk about how we should just cut off the Eastern Seaboard, for example. And he used to talk about nuclear weapons. I want to get one right in the men's room at the Kremlin. So he had some very, shall we say, risky language at the time. He was running for president. He was the conservative wing candidate, and the early front runner was Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York. And he was very much, he would call himself, he was a Rockefeller Republican, known as a liberal Eastern establishment Republican. He ran for the party's nomination, and what happened, California was winner take all. And before California, it came out that his former wife was essentially remarrying. And so obviously it came out in the news that people were remembering that Nelson Rockefeller had been divorced. And this was anathema to conservative values in the Republican Party.
How times change.
So Adlai Stevenson, when he ran for president twice, him being divorced was an elephantine issue against him. So in 1964, Nelson Rockefeller had been divorced. Prescott Bush, who was one of his immediate early supporters and a liberal Republican from Connecticut, the grandfather of George W. Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush, disavowed Nelson Rockefeller and said, basically, I can't believe this. What's happened. This man's been divorced. He's abandoned his family. So he stayed neutral in that race. And Goldwater won the California primary because there was a backlash because Rockefeller had been divorced. So Goldwater, who was very conservative, probably the most conservative candidate since Calvin Coolidge in 1924, probably really the only conservative Republican nominated since Calvin Coolidge in 1924, wins the nomination. And what happens? There is a mass exodus. Many Republicans and some independents go over to President Johnson, not because they like Johnson, because they're afraid of Goldwater. Goldwater gets up there at the Cow Palace, San Francisco, after Nelson Rockefeller gave a speech warning of extremism and gets booed by the young conservatives of the convention. Then Barry Goldwater gets up, gives his speech, and people are saying, well, Goldwater's going to temper his rhetoric. He's going to temper his rhetoric. He's going to talk about how he supports the United Nations, how he's been a moderate after all. Instead, he gets up there, gives a standard boilerplate speech, and then he says, and let me remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. He ran as Barry Goldwater. Now, later in that campaign, he tried to propitiate the more moderate wing of the party. He had a political advertisement where he's talking to Dwight Eisenhower, and Eisenhower says, yes, I support Barry Goldwater in person. He basically said the guy used to say he was dumb. But Goldwater also met with the Republican Governors Association and talked about how he's really a lot more moderate than than some of his rhetoric. But the bottom line is that year he wins the state of Arizona and five southern states, but loses the presidency badly to President Johnson, who wins 61.6% of the vote. And interestingly, Goldwater that year voted against the Civil Rights Act. And this is where there's really a chasm in the political parties. Northern Democrats, with the exception, every non-Southern Democrat, with the exception of Robert Byrd from West Virginia, voted for the Civil Rights Act. Every solitary Southern Democrat, except for Ralph Yarborough of Texas, voted against the Civil Rights Act. On the Republican side, many Western Republicans, like Barry Goldwater, for libertarian reasons, voted against the Civil Rights Act. Most liberal Republicans from the Northeast voted for the Civil Rights Act. And Barry Goldwater said, you have to go where the ducks are. So ever since then, Republicans have essentially been more appealing toward white Southerners than toward African Americans, who had really been the base of the Republican Party at the beginning.
What was the reason for that, other than racism? Like, why do the Southern Democrats oppose civil rights? On what grounds do you oppose civil rights? Was there something small in the bill they didn't like, or are they just, we're racist? We think that we're better than those people. We don't want them to have better equal rights.
This is an interesting question. In terms of some like Goldwater had actually been a member of the NAACP and was very much in favor of desegregation. For him, it was a libertarian issue. He thought it was unconstitutional. For Southern Democrats, there were some that probably were racist, like, for example, Richard Russell from Georgia, James Eastland from Mississippi, John Stennis from Mississippi. Then there are those who are accommodationists, who probably didn't really believe in it, but knew that was the only way that they could get reelected. The story is, for example, William Fulbright, who was Bill Clinton's mentor. Bill Clinton spent a lot of time driving William Fulbright in 1968 when he was running for his reelection, his last term. The story is Clinton would always argue with Fulbright about civil rights, and Fulbright was kind of, he would essentially say, well, this is what I have to do because this is what the people support, and as long as I'm opposed to the Vietnam War, the only way I can be an advocate of opposition and getting out of Vietnam, I have to stay in the United States. And in order for me to do that, I have to vote against the Civil Rights Act. He did that. He probably was not a racist himself. Was probably more what he had to do to stay in office. And I think there were a lot of Democrats who later in life apologized for their past vote. Strom Thurmond is one, for example, from South Carolina, who actually was originally a Democrat. Then he became a states' rights Democrat. Then later in life became a Republican. Robert Byrd, by the way, the only non-Southern Democrat who voted for the Civil Rights Act, later said it was one of the worst votes, that in the Gulf and Tonkin Resolution, right in 1964, that he had ever made. But you can see the hostility. Lady Bird Johnson, for example, she went on the Lady Bird Express. She was the first lady of the United States, and would go to southern states campaigning for President Johnson. And almost everywhere she went, there'd be racist chants at her because her husband had supported the Civil Rights Act. So I think a lot of it was they know their bread was buttered, and a lot of these Southern Democrats, either they were racist themselves or they were just doing what politicians essentially do, voting the will of their constituents so that they can stay in office.
All right. Let me finish up with, before I ask you where you're going to be in the near future, are you really good at the origin of phrases like I'm stripped to the buff and I'm going to throw my hat in the ring? Well, you addressed that hat part. But where do you suppose the phrase buff comes from? Buff means naked, I guess. Why does buff mean naked? You probably don't know, right?
No variation.
Like, wonder why buff means naked. I need to know that next time.
Well, I have something I want to know then. If you want to know about buff, I want to know this.
Go ahead.
The expression that people make all the time, they say they say he has his work cut out for him, and people think that means he's a lot of work to do. But if you have your work cut out for you, then somebody's already cut out your work, so that doesn't mean you have less work to do.
I think it means that back in the day when they had sweatshops, there would be people who would cut out the cloth, and then other people would have to sew it. That's my guess. Or leather working. But let me just look up buff.
Buff, yes.
Origin. See what we get. Now, buff, naked. We'll have it for next time. And if anybody knows where buff comes from, there has his work cut out for you. I see what you're saying. If my work's cut out, I don't have to do it anymore. If this is my list of stuff to do today, somebody cut out that part. I get it. All right. Thank you very much. Now you're going to be have a live appearance coming up, right?
I got a couple tomorrow, which would be Saturday, July 1st. This is both of they're going to have the Marblehead Festival of Arts in Marblehead, Mass. If you're around at the Unitarian Church, 28 Mugborough Street, Marblehead. I'll give a speech at 12 o'clock on Saturday about funny things that have happened on the political campaign trail. And then on Sunday at 3 p.m., I'll do a political trivia session, and they're both free and open to the public. And my book, The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, Political Trivia on Steroids, will be available for purchase for $20.
Nice. And then you're at Caesar's Palace the week after that, right?
If somebody would invite me, I wish. Absolutely. I can explain. I'll go to Caesar's Palace, and I'll explain the Aristotle's view of politics.
There you go.
I'm sure that would get a huge audience, and I'm sure that maybe I can then do it at some bars that night.
So
maybe in Las Vegas, all over. I'll be speaking at every bar in Las Vegas, and You will be speaking about Aristotle versus Socrates and their views on government. And I'm sure I'll get a huge crowd. And I'm sure they'll love it.
When you do your talks, not the trivia one, because I know how that will go. How does it go? You're going to talk to a group of people, and what's the topic for the first one that's not trivia? What's the topic? That's
going to be essentially funny things that have happened on political campaign trails, bloopers, dirty tricks that politicians have done. Basically a lighthearted view of the political campaign trail. I'm going to start from 1840 when William Henry Harrison won and go to contemporaneous times. Okay, good.
So keep us. And where are this going to be? Can anyone go, or is it private events?
No, so they're having the Marblehead Festival of Arts. So anyone can come to Marblehead, and they're going to be having arts festivals all over the town. And the first one, and they're going to at the Unitarian Church, they're going to be a literary fest. There'll be a bunch of different events, and my first one will be Saturday, and then the second one will be Sunday. And these are things that I certainly have spoken before. I often speak for example, to different groups, senior centers, that type of thing, and I try to give about an hour presentation about different things in politics. Like last week, I was in Framingham, and I spoke about how this country got so divided.
Wow. Did we already address that in one of our sessions ever?
How we got divided, I don't think so, but that would be a great topic.
All right. So especially since you've already given the talk, you'll be good at it.
I would love to do that.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll do that next week. How's that?
Sounds superlative.
Superlative. Okay. Well, there you go, Rich. Rich Rubino. Appreciate it. I'm Bradley J. And I would like you to subscribe to there's a lot of things I could ask you to do. Follow my radio show, but I'll just go to my travel channel on YouTube and subscribe to it. If you don't have a YouTube account, for crying out loud, why not? What's the year? This is 1985. No, it's later than that. Do it. It's easy. And YouTube is the best. And once you do get there, search Bradley J Travel and bloop, just subscribe. So I'll talk to you soon. Rich, thanks.
Thank you so much. Can't wait to come back next week.
All right.